And just a little background information. The reason why we talk about Asia's 18th century is to emphasize that the 18th century world is much more globalized and connected than people give it credit to. And if you look at the map over there, you're going to see just like the tracing of all of the routes done by the British East India Company connecting markets as far east as Asia, China, India, and the extensive global network connected the entire of the British Empire. We have the very famous triangle trade connecting the East Coast with the Caribbean, Africa, but I also want to focus more on the kind of the leg going from like Europe, Asia, and the Americas. So when we talk about trade and happening in Asia, like I also want to emphasize something about this, Asia as it looked like the 18th century. It was very much a diverse place where many peoples from different countries, different systems of government all lived. You have, the powerhouse being China at the time of the period. You have it being centralized under the Qing dynasty. You have Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate, and then you have, Southeast Asia, as well as India under a variety of different Raj, with the beginnings of the British and French colonialism happening in that area as well. So, yeah, Dutch, French, Indians from a variety of different principalities and governments, Southeast Asians from the Philippines, Thailand, as well as, Laos and Cambodia, and of course, Chinese and Japanese. And interspersed all throughout that is a language of trade, and that's the primary way of how, the the English world is connecting with the Asian societies at the time. We're very aware of how Chinese porcelain is a big hit in the West as well, because remember before the 18th century, most of the kind of eating vessels or drinking vessels are all out of stoneware or pewter, which is quite heavy. So when Chinese porcelain becomes available, it's a huge hit because it's incredibly light, it's beautiful, and on top of that, true Chinese porcelain is actually quite heat resistant. You should be able to even heat water in it. So as part of that, it becomes basically a fashion statement. And likewise, it's not just a single like one-way, trade network. You have American ginseng being sourced here in the 13 colonies, in particular in Western Virginia, being shipped by the ton to China because Chinese people realize that it's pretty equivalent to ginseng itself, which has medicinal properties in Chinese culture. And even though it doesn't quite necessarily part of the ginseng family, it's just called American ginseng, and it becomes a major export coming from the United States all the way to China. And of course, the kind of reinterpretation is a dialogue, really. It's not just goods being shipped from one to the other. It's people copying different tastes and aesthetics onto their own. So if you look on the portrait over here in front, it's a kind of porcelain plate, but it doesn't come from China. It's what we call soft face porcelain. It is a copy of Chinese aesthetics done by a British manufacturer, in this case, the Bow factory in England. And basically, if you look more closely, it just mimics the Chinese aesthetics. It's not quite true Chinese in terms of like taste, because I can tell you already, Chinese people don't actually exactly go around looking at vases and pointing at them and saying how pretty it is. This is basically the Bow porcelain factory just saying like, look how good we are. And if you look on the bottom there, you're actually going to see that the Bow factory is printed at the bottom of the vase. So it's shameless self-promotion from their part over there. And likewise, Chinese culture, Chinese artisans also have their fair share of mistakes too. This is a kind of a custom Chinese plate done by Chinese artisans, showcasing what you call like a coat of arms, heraldry done, custom made for the family of Dobry. And at that time, it's very kind of fashionable to have your, heraldry kind of custom printed on the plate. And this is a 2-year process, basically. You have to not only draw your family heraldry, you have to label it, send it to through an agent all the way to China, who then contact artisans in China with their custom orders, saying like, I want X number of plates, X number of bowls, and X number of like sets for dinner with this heraldry. And if you look over there on the right, you're going to see that they actually have red, green, and all the labelings done as part of the custom order because these Chinese artisans don't know anything about Western heraldry. So they couldn't understand what's actually part of the instructions versus what's actually part of the design. So that got included. And if you kind of notice it there too, the red part is, the red label is actually painted green and the green part is painted red. So truly, Ordering things from, online hasn't really changed all that much. I think people still kind of get things wrong, 200 years in the past and as well as today. But not to say that it was just kind of something was lost in translation. Occasionally, through cooperation, you have beautiful things being created. And this is what in front of here is what you call the Haiyantang, which is basically a Western mansion that was commissioned by the Chinese Qianlong Emperor through Jesuit missionaries who were being, quite present in China at that time. And he commissioned them to kind of design an entire Western style mansion in China as part of the Summer Palace complex. And this is a beautiful syncretism of both Chinese and Western architecture because if you notice, like from the outside, it looks almost like any other Western mansion with kind of the Baroque symmetrical lines. But in the front, you see a water fountain with 12 animals of the Chinese zodiac. So I think it's such a beautiful way to combine those two cultures into one kind of nice package. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist today. It was destroyed through the Second Opium War, and if on the bottom you see kind of what remains of it. But we have illustrations of the time period, so we can kind of imagine what it looked like in the past. And likewise, we have actual, Chinese goods besides tea and porcelain coming through to the East Coast. Here we have like Chinese silk coming in mass quantities to be part of the fashionable statements for the elites here in the East Coast, in particular Virginia to New Jersey, Pennsylvania. This is a Chinese silk waistcoat coming from, China, and it's currently sitting in the Colonial Windsor collections. And just a little detail in here, this is silk damask, which is embroidery done as part of the actual weaving process of that silk. And if you notice the pattern itself is kind of Western, it's an example of the Chinese making particular silk damask exclusively for the Western export market. So the Chinese recognize the importance of the Western market and they'll custom make goods just to cater to that. And just because it's been, we have silk here, we also have a cotton gown coming from India in this case. This is what you call long, printed cotton, basically. And the cotton you have in India is quite particular because what you call long staple cotton as opposed to American cotton grown at the time, which is short staple. All you need to know is that the fibers are longer and it leads to a much finer, much higher quality good. And that's why to this day, if you go ask for like Egyptian cotton, which is long staple, they'll charge you much more than regular American cotton. And just because these textiles are being sold to both, elite women and elite men, it doesn't preclude lower class from taking, part in this global trade. Here we have an example of what you call an Indian printed neckerchief, which is very commonly seen around the necks of fishermen, sailors, any kind of labor working class person in the 13 colonies. And these are everywhere. Because even though the cotton itself is imported and it can be quite expensive, it doesn't preclude people from the working class environment to purchase these goods. Because we all know people who are, necessarily, lower income than ourselves or coming from a different background, they can not necessarily be able to afford a full suit from Gucci or a fashionable icon or fashion label like that, but they can afford maybe a small accessory like a belt or a purse or so forth, and that becomes a symbol of their own personal taste as well as a way to just showcase their individuality and the fact that they can indeed afford maybe a smaller item to showcase their social standing amongst their peers. But you're primarily here to talk about people. Everybody knows about trade, tea, porcelain, and textiles, but what about the people? And that's something that I've been doing research the past 10 years because when I worked at historical sites, people would ask me a question if people of Asian descent were supposed to be in the 13 colonies, and I didn't have a good answer to tell them. I actually went back to other historians and asked them, like, can you tell me if you know more about this? And unfortunately, they would just come back to me and tell me, like, hey, we think they're there, but we're not sure. So I went back and like dug through historical archives looking for what you call primary sources, sources that come from the time period written by people from that time period. And because I think that's the best way to kind of gauge if they were truly there. And just a little bit of background too. A lot of the time when we talk about Asia's 18th century, they're referred to with the term of East Indians. And that is a pure term for people coming from all the way from like Southeast Asia, India, all the way to Japan in the 18th century. Because that is opposed to the West Indies, which is the Caribbean in the 18th century. So when I went through all these historical archives and did my research, I found mentions of East Indians in the 18th century. And as far as I can tell, they fall broadly over three categories. And those categories are the following: the honored guest, the sailor, and the servant. Because in a society dictated amongst free and enslaved white and black, how do people that don't necessarily fit into either category get treated by people around them in a Western society? And that is what people in the historian Angela He calls a racial liminal space, which I think is a very good way to, describe them. And people in the West, in England and North America, will fall back to how these Asians are coming in the first place to kind of dictate how they're treated. If they come from a very high social standing, they'll get treated as basically free whites. And if they come quite poor, or worse comes to worse, they come as enslaved people, they will be treated as equivalent to enslaved African Americans in the same social standing as well. And when I describe like a lot of these, Asian people coming to England, North America, I'll probably be referring to what you call runaway ads as well as descriptors using wording from the 18th century. So a little bit of a warning there. And I don't do that just to be mean. I just think it's an important way to kind of highlight and derive a lot of knowledge from their background, as well as infer a lot of information based on where they are or how they're treated by the language used by the people who are interacting with them. So we'll start with the people who are called the honored guests, and those are the easiest because they're probably the most well documented and the most well treated. So when we talk about honored guests, these are Asians coming to England in particular, or in some cases North America, that are coming out of their own volition, either self-funded or coming as part of the official diplomatic embassy as part of their governments. And as soon as they come over to North America or England, they get treated really, really well because people are going to see them coming in with quite a lot of wealth, so they'll default to saying like, "Oh, okay, they're one of us." A good example of this here is going to be Cheat-Kwa or Tan Shet-Kwa. He's going to be a Chinese artisan coming to London around 1770, 1771. And he makes like little porcelain busts of people, and he's charging an insane amount of money for them. He's charging each one of those figures about 10 to 15 guineas each, which, for reference, a average laborer in London is likely to make about 3 guineas a year for their annual wages. So just like that, he's charging 5 times the average annual wage for one of those figures. So he's making hordes of money. And here we have him depicted by John Hamilton Mortimer, who's one of the most prominent English artists. So the fact that he's being featured in an oil medium here, as in a painting, kind of tells us how much he's kind of esteemed by the English, academics there, as well as the kind of the artists or like the artist class. He's not just an artisan; he's an artist and an elite artist at that, and he's welcome as one of them. Like one of my favorite paintings of all time is this painting here by Johann Joseph Zoffany. He's one of the most prominent artists of the 18th century in London. And this is a painting called The Exhibitions of the Royal Academy. It's from 1771, from the same time. And it just basically showcases a who's who of the top English artists of the time. And if you look on the kind of like far left corner, if you zoom on in, guess who's there? Kind of interspersed. That's Tan Shet Kwa right there. And his placement tells me that he's a bit of like a last minute addition. But the fact that he's even there in the first place tells us that he was considered one of them, one of the top English artists at that time, as a kind of an honored guest in this case. And if you notice how he's dressed, in many ways he's dressed in like the Qing Dynasty hat and his robes. And people all described him as being dressed after the fashion of his country in a traditional Chinese garment. So he gets to keep his garments as a way to kind of mark not only his status but his exoticness as well. Um, Unfortunately, I can tell that because of his documentation of his prominence, his return trip is also documented too. And unfortunately, he doesn't have a safe trip back home. He kind of gets blown away out of the ship because of a strong gust. Kind of picks him up from because of his ropes, and he falls overboard. And the sailors in the ship kind of treat it as a really bad omen. They're very superstitious, so they think that number one, he's dressed like a girl, dressed like a woman with all his robes, and he gets blown overboard. So they think like, oh man, he's just bad luck. They threaten to throw him overboard again and for good. And Tanshakwa begs the captain to kind of let him out of the ship because he cannot bear to stay with such a hostile crew around him. The captain kind of abides by that. He understands and he sends him back to the, basically Plymouth uh, aboard like the ship's skiff, like a rowboat basically. And unfortunately, the people around like the docks kind of see like this guy sopping wet, being dropped off like on this rowboat. They think that he's being kidnapped actually by the people crewing the rowboat. So they kind of storm the rowboat and kind of try to beat them up a little bit. But thankfully, like they kind of explain through broken English what's happening, and they get to back off. So eventually, Tashakwa like waits in the shore again for the next year to sail back to China. And in his return voyage, it is remarked that he is fully dressed in Western garments, English suit, cocked hat, suit, and waistcoat and breeches to try to avoid any repeat of the last time. And plus, we have the case of Mr. John Anthony here. And if you notice over here, the painting is of a gentleman kind of done with a Western haircut, Western suit. And it kind of showcases that some of the Chinese people coming to England are going to go as far as, apply for and be granted British citizenship. And the fact that he is even adopting Western haircut is quite significant here too. I don't want to bother you guys reading like the full description. You guys can read it on your own time. But the fact that he is adopting a Western name, converting to Anglicanism, and on top of that, changing his hair, tells us that he never intends to go back to China. Because at that time, Chinese people were required by law to have what you call a Manchu queue, basically shave the front part of their hair and have a long ponytail behind them. And that's a sign of loyalty to the reigning Qing dynasty, basically. And for them to cut the hair in any way would be viewed as a sign of treason. Basically, a common saying in the Qing dynasty was keep the hair, keep the head, lose the hair, lose the head. Cutting that hair was a sign of treason, and if you cut that hair, you're basically exiled for life. And the fact that, John Anthony in this case is showcased with a cut ponytail tells us he never intends to go back. And eventually, like he does unfortunately pass away in the 1800s, and his funeral is kind of like a very interesting syncretism of combining these two, Chinese and English cultures. So even though he converts to Anglicanism, uh, his funeral is a combination of both, English and Chinese culture. So his funeral service is Anglican, church service, hearse. Everybody kind of knows how it works. But leading this funeral procession, this cortege, is not only like most members of the Chinese community in England at the time, they're all dressed in white, which is in Chinese culture the Chinese color of mourning. So here we have in his funeral combination of both English and Chinese cultures. And the reason why he's even in England at the time is because the British East India Company is going to be hiring so many sailors from China and India that they're going to hire John Anthony to serve as a liaison for these Chinese sailors and the company itself. Because allegedly, these Chinese sailors and Indian sailors are very experienced with the currents, the winds, and the routes required to sail these trading ships from England all the way to China. However, the argument by the British sailors is that you're hiring these Chinese and Indian sailors because you'll work for less and thus you're stealing our jobs. So once again, we kind of see that times really haven't changed all that much. Which brings me to my next category of people, the sailors, these Chinese and Asian sailors coming all the way to North America and in England, and they will occupy a sort of middle ground because, sailors of the century are considered a form of artisan. It is skilled trade to be a sailor. So since they bring something to the table, they're not quite upper class because they work for a living, but they're also not quite lower class either. They kind of occupy like a middle ground because of their skills, but requiring to work. And here we have an example of like more documented people coming to North America in particular. And this is one of my personal favorites. This is the case of Chow Mandarin. And he's going to be a Chinese sailor coming to North America. And unfortunately, he's going to die and due to kind of an accident. He falls to the mast of the ship Mac. And sad for him, but great for us because we have a great example of his tombstone in Boston. If you go to the Central Burial Grounds in Boston, you're going to find his tombstone. And actually, that's a photo I took of that tombstone because once I found about that, like I had to visit it. So you had the scene of me surrounded by some pretty puzzled cemetery workers saying like, why is this guy freaking over a tombstone that's been there for centuries? And here I am just like, oh my gosh, It's there. It's here. Oh man. But the fact that, the captain went ahead and even, purchased that tombstone, like, uh, and had it custom made for, Chow Mandarin is quite telling of the appreciation that the captain had about what happened, as well as the actual, person that, the tombstone is for, Chow Mandarin, which is, by the way, a fantastic name. It's like calling somebody Tony Italian. And it kind of parallels what you see with Asians in the 18th century in North America. A lot of times when like these sailors and other people of lower social classes come to North America, they don't get to retain their actual original names. They're given English or anglicized names as a way to kind of ease, like, I guess, their perception or kind of ease the navigation of American or English societies at the time. Unless you're a super high class like Tan Shakwa, then you get to keep your name. But that's what makes researching sailors and people of lower social classes of Asian descent or Asian origin in the Western world incredibly difficult. Because unless you know who they are or you have more context about their names in general, like John Mandarin, which is a dead giveaway that he's coming from China, they kind of tend to blend in into Western society. And because of that, it's a little hard to kind of see like have a lot of like actual artifacts from them. One of the lucky finds I was able to like dig up is this kind of print, watercolor from Gabriel Bray. He's going to be an officer in one of the Royal Navy ships, and this is from which basically imagine a bunch of like collections of like watercolors he did of his voyage as part of that, and it's currently in the Greenwich Maritime Museum. And if you see there, like this is what you call like an Oriental sailor, probably from China, kind of showing off his parlor trick that he can put his leg behind his head. I cannot do that. Don't ask me to do that in camera. It's going to be a lot of screaming, a lot of pain. So maybe we'll move on ahead. But then we're going to move on to like this kind of final category. And these are going to be the people that are going to be the most present in North America and in England by a large margin. The sources for that come from what you call runaway ads. And those are going to be ads that people who kind of own these people, either as masters of the servants or actually owning them outright as part of, because they're enslaved people, put on a magazine or a newspaper saying like, hey, this person ran away. If you find them, please bring them back to me. I'll give you a reward. And it's because of these runaway ads that I get to have the most documentation from them. Here you have a kind of like watercolor sketch done by Paul Sanby, like I mentioned before, like one of the most famous artists of the 18th century. And this is an Indian servant to Duke of Cumberland. And the way that we kind of see them behind, see them portrayed both in the runaway ads and in these illustrations tells us a lot about uh, basically who they are because of what they can or cannot wear and how they're described. So here we have like this Indian servant clearly, but if you notice how he's dressed in a full 18th century English style suit, waistcoat, and breeches. But if you look at the head, it's kind of like a turban. And I can tell you already, this turban is not close to anything you're going to see in actually, being worn by people in India. So what that is basically a turban that's been kind of reinterpreted along English lines to kind of emphasize how exotic he is, but within English taste. Because at that time, it's quite fashionable to have an exotic servant to showcase how worldly cosmopolitan you are. They can afford to have somebody basically brought from overseas just to serve you. A good example of that too is going to be Huang Yitong. He's going to be a servant to the third Duke of Dorset, John Sackville. And this is a painting done by Sir Joshua Reynolds, another very prominent artist. And here you have the fact that he's dressed in Chinese clothing, but it does not quite fit him properly because the hat he wears and the clothing he wears is not quite accurate to somebody from China of his social standing. The robe and the hat are part of kind of like a Qing Dynasty official uniform for a government official. And based on like when Huang Yitong and how young he is when he comes to England, he's only about 19, 20. There is no way that he could be wearing such a uniform on official capacity. So here you have an example of what you call chinoiserie, uh, you know, a reinterpretation of Chinese aesthetics from an English lens. So basically, it's the Duke of Dorset dressing Huang Yitong in Chinese clothing, even though he is not meant for him, as way to emphasize his exogenous to a Western audience. Um, and here we have like an example of like one of those runaway ads. And if you look over here, the text is almost identical to almost any of the runaways ad you're going to see for African Americans who are enslaved as well. And the reason why I brought this one is because this is one of the few examples of an enslaved Asian that I can document to not only Scotland at the time, but also because I have his illustration, but not directly. So this is a case of Caesar. He's going to be somebody from the East Indies. And based on his description and where Secretary Monroe serves, he is going to be brought from somewhere in modern day Bangladesh or India. Because Secretary Monroe, who's his master, is going to be serving as part of like the British military in those theaters of war as part of the First and Second Carnatic Wars, which are colonial conflicts, by England in India. And if you kind of look over here on this painting of Secretary Monroe, look on the left. That, all likelihood, is going to be Caesar. Like his facial features are very much of somebody from Asia at the time, dark skin, smooth dark hair, and it's just like a tantalizing glimpse of what their lives probably would have looked like in the 18th century. Always on the margins, never quite on focus. And kind of go zoom on in, you can see that he's, serving as kind of like a waiting man, holding Circuit Monroe's horse. And unfortunately, because of their enslaved status, it kind of leads into a lot of difficulty with research. Number one, they were probably illiterate, so they wouldn't leave a lot of historical records behind. And number two, even if they did, people wouldn't quite deem it important enough to preserve it. And that's why we have a lot of evidence or a lot of the writings from our founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, because people knew from the beginning that they would be important and whatever they wrote would be significant and of historical significance, so it would be worthy of preservation. But other stories of people who are of lower social standing or from different backgrounds were not deemed as important at that time, so they get lost to time. So through them, we kind of have to infer from what we have and kind of make inferences as best as we can. So when it comes to East Indians or Asian Americans or Asians in America itself, the preponderance of evidence points us to us being enslaved, of an enslaved status. And here we have the Virginia Gazette and Norfolk. And you can see time and time again, we have a description of where they are, run away, their physical descriptor, as well as reward and a description of their clothing. Time and time again, this is exactly parallel to runaway ads for enslaved African Americans. So we can see that their status and social standing is the same as any other enslaved African American. But time and time again, they make the distinction to describe them as East Indian or East Indian born. That tells us that even though they're the same social standing, they're important enough to signify then that they are Asian, as demographically different than enslaved African Americans. And I kind of want to bring it to this particular ad because I was able to find this one in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, which is, closer to you guys than Virginia, which I think is a bit more relevant and more significant to you guys. So here we have a runaway ad from Perth Amboy. And this is, reads like this. Take it up and committed to the jail in Perth Amboy, a black boy about 16 years of age with bushy hair, not resembling the African Negroes, and had on a check shirt, Oxford trousers, speaks pretty good English, says he's born in Bombay in the East Indies, and that he came to New York from St. Croix and the Snow Nancy, which is the ship, captained by Hind, as he's taken up with suspicion of being a runaway slave or servant, if he is such, by his master, or by applying to the jailer and Amboy aforesaid, pay the charges, can have him. Basically, all this says is, I have picked up this, the 16-year-old kid. He doesn't look like any of the black people I've picked up before. He's clearly not African American. He has a bushy hair, kind of curly hair, but not African American black hair. But I don't know what he is. He says he's from India, but I'm not sure what that means. If you own him or his master, pick him up, and I'll make sure that, I'll get the reward, basically. So once again, you see that you have people aware of what Asia is, but they're not sure how to treat Asia in the 18th century. And immediately, it's because of the low status of this runaway person, the 16-year-old, who unfortunately don't know his name. you know, he gets treated as almost almost with like, with almost hostile suspicion, basically, saying like, hey, you should not be wandering around by yourself. I'm gonna go ahead and preemptively arrest you. So when we talk about the revolution, you're talking about Asian people who are serving in the United States as enslaved people and how they're going to navigate the chaos of the revolution as enslaved. And that's something that we see happen with African Americans as well. Like the revolution argues is a fight for the rights of the people, we the people, against tyranny. Well, how do you kind of fit the narrative when you have like active, slavery happening at the time? And that brings it to the one of the most like interesting people like I've ever read about. And this is the case of Charles Peters. And I want to single him out in particular because he's very documented. And because of this runaway ad of, they have on screen, basically, this is a deserter ad. Deserter ads are placed by the officers of a regiment in the American Army or even British Army sometimes in case a soldier deserts his post and runs away. So the fact that we have Charles Peters here mentioned as an East Indian as a deserter tells us he joined the Continental Army. And after research done with John Reese as well as Jonathan Clements, we're able to dig more information on him. He was brought over to Charleston, North Carolina in the 1760s also alongside his mother called Asia. Most likely, Asia and Charles Peters are not the original names, but the names given to them by their master, as a gentleman called Mr. Tomlinson in Charleston, North Carolina. And when the revolution kicks off, Tomlinson comes out as a diehard Tory or a loyalist. So Charles Peters goes ahead and does something quite astounding, quite unusual. He goes ahead and sues his master, Tomlinson, and argues that since he's enslaved, he is property. And if he is property of a loyalist, Tomlinson, he should be confiscated by the revolutionary government of North Carolina and placed in the custody of the government of North Carolina. The county says, no way. They throw his suit out of the court. He then goes ahead and appeals that suit, and it goes to the state level court. And ultimately, the state of North Carolina sides with him and confiscates him on the condition that he'll be set free and allowed to join the Continental Army because the Continental Army would only allow free men at that time to join. So through there, he's given his freedom and joins the 6th Regiment of North Carolina to fight the revolution. And from his service record, we can track him to serving in the Battle of White Plains. We can track him to serving in Valley Forge, which is great for us, but not for him because it's a terrible time for everybody involved. And eventually, he gets documented to being sent and deployed for the Siege of Charleston, which is also great for us, but terrible for him because Siege of Charleston is one of those greatest military disasters for the American Army ever. Basically, all you need to know, Siege of Charleston, the American Army gets surrounded. The British basically capture everyone. It's a disaster, utter disaster. And as far as we know, Charles Peters' trail kind of runs cold afterwards. We know for a fact that he was probably sent to Barbados, but the records are in Barbados right now. So unfortunately, unless somebody here is willing to kind of sponsor me to go on a trip to Barbados in the summer, preferably to do quote unquote historical research, I'm afraid it's going to be wherever his story ends for now. But here we have an Asian person coming from like Madras because of his of the documentation we have from his enslavement papers, basically how he was imported to Charleston, modern day Chennai, India, basically Madras is modern day Chennai, India. That he's using the revolution as a way to kind of argue his way towards freedom, and we can kind of document other people serving in like kind of being caught in this in the revolution. And here you have like John Newton. Basically, he's in one of the probably one of the best runaway stories ever because basically this is a runaway ad from the Virginia Gazette. He tells his master, uh, don't worry, don't worry. Like they're riding somewhere like Lee Courthouse, basically. Imagine like middle Virginia. They're riding, his alongside his master, serving as like a waiting man or a servant, like a pretty high up, equivalent to a butler today. And they're riding together on the horse. And basically, his master, notices that the horse is tiring, the servant, John Newton in this case, just tells him like, "Don't worry, we'll switch horses. You take the one that my mind is fresher, and I'll just catch up with you later at the tavern." They go their separate ways, and John Newton never shows up again. He basically just takes the horse and runs. So it's a classic example of like, "Don't worry, man, I'll catch up with you," and he never does, and he just runs away. And if you notice on the timing of that, that's July 13th, 1776. We're only a few weeks away from the 250th anniversary of that. And think of what's happening concurrently around his basically running away attempt. You have shots being fired over several months ago, Alex getting conquered. Blood has been spilled. People in Virginia are mobilizing for war. They have the formations of the first and second regiments of line in Virginia, as well as New Jersey are forming their own militias. They're forming their own regiments, and people are gearing up for war. And blood has been spilt already. Like it's only a question of like, are we really going to go for a full independence, or is going to be like a last ditch attempt at reconciliation with the crown? And people are leaning on saying like, no, like we have to commit for full independence. And what does independence mean even? The discussions are ongoing. And you have John Newton, an enslaved person from East India, from Asia, saying like, "Hey, I'm caught in the middle of this. What does independence mean to me?" And I know it may not be historical from my perspective as a proper historian to kind of try to infer his motivations, but you can't help but think if, that's also going through his mind. What does "we the people" mean to him? Are all men created equal? Does that also apply to me as well? And then leveraging the revolution as a way to say like, hey, maybe it's time for me to kind of pursue my own freedom as well. And that is not a one kind of a sided affair. This is what you call a Chelsea pensioner application, because we see Asians serving the revolution as well on the British side. But the British side is interesting because they don't come from runaway ads primarily. Like the British Army is pretty professional at the time, and they have a very much definitive, like a definitive structure. And from there, I have two pensioner records, and the way that they're described is they have their name, where they're born, and then this one you kind of barely make out in the middle of the page, East Indies, and the name of the person, John Colby. No, no, the regiment of, let's see, John Buckley. That's his name. And he's described as being born in the East Indies, and he's going to serve in the 23rd Regiment of Line as a drummer. And that's kind of like the perception we have of Asians in the British Army. Like they're a bit more documented because the paperwork is more present. And as far as we can tell, they're all being kind of, if they're born abroad, if they're exotic, they're kind of shifted as drummers almost immediately, basically, because it's fashionable to have an exotic drummer. We see that kind of parallel with Hessians, Germans serving in America. They find a lot of African Americans run away to the British forces. They immediately grab them and put them as drummers in their own unit. So you actually have a small African diaspora as the Hessians are, evacuated from Yorktown. After the surrender, they get sent back to Hessing Castle, and they bring with them these African drummers that ran away with them too. So you have a small African American community there. But for these Asian drummers, they're present, and in this case, John Buckley, he's going to be one of the drummers for the 23rd Regiment of Foot, which is coincidentally the same regiment stationed in Boston for the Boston Massacre. So, whoops. And he's going to be present there for the Boston Massacre, and he's going to be eventually deployed also to the Battle of White Plains, and eventually going to serve in the New York campaign. There's another guy that I can document as part of the 60th Regiment of Foot. He's going to be a bugler, so imagine like a guy playing the trumpet. He's going to be attached to more of like a light infantry company basically. So like imagine it's like skirmishers. So from there, like we can see that Asians are present in revolution, and they're arguing from both sides of the fence, arguing for independence and fighting for against independence. And throughout that all, they're kind of navigating this perception of like neither being fully white, but not being fully black. So where do they fall? Well, it's going to depend on how they're perceived by their community. And as part of that, they're going to be integrated into upper, middle, or lower social classes depending on, how they come to the United States or England. And through it, they'll be integrated to their communities for good or ill, and they'll navigate this society that's changing as part of the revolution and kind of determining for themselves what does revolution mean to them. Does it mean freedom, independence in the case of Charles Peters, or just it means a deployment figure for these people serving the British Army? And eventually, we're going to see the discussion pop over and over again with the Chinese Exclusion Act, with the discussion of what it means to be an American, what it means to be we the people. And that is a discussion and an answer that I cannot give to the audience today. That is an answer that you must give yourselves. What it means to be we the people. But I can assist with one comment, if I may. I think the definition of we the people has changed over time to include or exclude a variety of people. But I think fundamentally, their stories have not. All of us come to the United States either voluntarily or involuntarily, but the journey is there. There's always a struggle to determine what it means to be an American and the struggle to determine and eventually achieve what we always desire, this freedom to pursue our own happiness, to achieve the so-called American dream. And eventually, I think it's quite telling that in Chinese culture, the nickname given to America in the 19th century is Gold Mountain. It's a land of opportunity, and I think that opportunity should extend to to the future. I think even though America has not lived up to its ideals always, has always struggled sometimes and has fallen short sometimes, I think that's the beauty of the American experiment. Because sometimes we have failed, it doesn't mean we cannot succeed in the future. So we should always strive to live up to the ideals of what makes the American country, the United States, the United States. And that is the ideals that were pushed by our founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and so forth, all the people who wrote the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Those ideals remain, and we should live up to those ideals written down now and forever, not just because of the 50th, but for the foreseeable future, for our own sakes, and for the sakes of those who will come after us. Thank you very much. I want to extend the floor now for any kind of questions. You have my email there, so if you have any criticisms, commentary, insults you want to throw at me real quick too, go on ahead.